Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into a topic that's intensely personal and universally fascinating. Emotions. I mean, we all feel them, right? But how do we even begin to explain them?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And what's really intriguing is that we're going to approach this from both the psychological and the philosophical angles. Two fields that, while different in their methods, are both kind of wrestling with this core puzzle of what makes us, feel.
Okay, I'm hooked already. So I gave you a whole stack of articles and research on all these different theories of emotion, and honestly, it was a little intimidating.
Lots of material.
Yeah, so that's why we're here, right? To break it all down into the most important insights for our listeners.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that there's just so much debate about even the basics. Like, are emotions these like universal hardwired reactions? Or are they something our minds like just create on the fly?
Okay, so let's break it down. We'll be exploring four main families of theories: evolutionary, stimulus evaluation, response evaluation, and psychological construction, each one giving us a different lens to look through at this whole complex landscape.
Sounds good.
So to kick things off, evolutionary theories, like as the name suggests, this looks back to our ancestral past, right? It proposes that emotions are basically these hardwired survival mechanisms that have been honed by evolution. Think like fight or flight, those super instinctive responses that we share with so many animals.
Right.
So we're like pre-programmed to feel fear when we sense danger because it helped our caveman ancestors avoid becoming some saber-toothed tiger's lunch.
Precisely. Yeah, these theories suggest we have these specific affect programs for emotions like fear, anger, and joy. So you can kind of think of them like blueprints in our brains that trigger these distinct patterns in both our body and our behavior whenever they're activated.
Hold on, affect programs. Break that down for me a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So think of it this way. Imagine there's a program in your brain labeled fear. And then when you encounter something dangerous, that program just fires up, causing your heart to race, your breathing to quicken, your muscles tense up, and, ultimately preparing you to fight or flee.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So if these affect programs are so universal, wouldn't we expect to see similar expressions of emotion across different cultures?
Exactly. And there's actually some really fascinating research to support this. Studies have shown that people from all these vastly different cultures, even those who have been blind since birth, show remarkably similar facial expressions for those basic emotions, suggesting that those expressions might actually be innate and not simply learned from our surroundings.
That's pretty convincing. But I'm guessing there's another side to this story.
Of course, not everyone buys into this idea of these like hardwired affect programs, right? Critics argue that the observed patterns in facial expressions just aren't distinct enough to really prove that each emotion has this unique program. And they suggest that, learning and culture could still play a significant role in actually shaping how we express our emotions.
So it's not as simple as just saying, this facial expression always equals this emotion.
Right. And even within that evolutionary camp, there's definitely room for nuance. One researcher, Scarantino, he argues that the output of these effect programs might actually be a lot more abstract and flexible than initially thought. It's like having this basic blueprint for an emotion, but then the specific details can actually change depending on the situation.
Okay, that makes things even more interesting. So it's not just about these pre-programmed reactions.
Yeah.
There's a level of adaptability built in as well. But if it's not all about instinct, how much of our emotional experience is actually shaped by how we interpret the world around us? That brings us to our next category, right? Stimulus evaluation theories.
Exactly. Stimulus evaluation theories, or SETIs for short, really shift that focus from instinct to appraisal. So SETIs suggest that our emotions are actually triggered by how we evaluate or appraise situations.
So it's not just about the event itself, but what it means to me.
Precisely. Let's say you encounter a barking dog. Your emotional response won't just be solely determined by the dog's presence. It will depend on how you actually appraise that situation. Do you see the dog as a threat? Do you see it as a friendly companion? Or maybe you just see it as an annoyance.
So my fear of the dog, it's not just like a simple on-off switch. It's shaped by this whole web of, nuanced evaluations. That's pretty insightful, but hold on, there are different versions of SETIs, right? Don't some focus more on the cause of the appraisal, while others emphasize the content? It seems a bit complicated.
You're right, there are subtle distinctions. But for our deep dive today, let's focus on this core difference. Some SETIs really emphasize the evaluation itself, like, is this dangerous? Or is this beneficial? Or is this unjust? While others focus on what caused that evaluation. Was it the dog itself? Or was it just, rumors you heard about this dog? Or maybe even a caffeine-induced anxiety that was just making you extra jumpy.
Okay, I see the difference. So it's not just about labeling the situation as scary, it's also about understanding why I'm even labeling it that way in the first place. But what are these evaluative properties that I keep hearing about?
Ah, good question. You can think of those like labels that we attach to situations to help us make sense of them emotionally. These labels, things like danger, offense, loss, or even things like beauty or fairness, really influence the type of emotional response that we're going to experience.
So it's like my mind is running through this checklist. Is this threatening? Okay, yes. Okay, initiate fear response.
Well, it's not quite that robotic. There's a lot more nuance involved. And the way we appraise situations, it's not always so black and white, right? And that's where this idea of molar versus molecular evaluations comes in.
Molar and molecular. You lost me again.
No worries, it's actually pretty simple. Molar evaluations, think of them like really broad brushstrokes, focusing on overall categories like this is dangerous or this is a loss. Molecular evaluations, on the other hand, get into those like nitty-gritty details. Things like, how relevant is this to my goals? Is this even controllable? Am I to blame for this? So these more granular evaluations really provide a much more nuanced and dimensional understanding of all of our emotional responses.
So instead of just feeling sad, I might also be feeling a sense of powerlessness or unfairness or, yeah, any number of other things depending on the specifics of the situation.
Precisely. And this leads us to, I think, a really fascinating development in Setier's this concept of embodied evaluations. So this idea suggests that our bodily sensations aren't just these passive outputs of emotion, but they can actually influence how we appraise situations in the first place.
Wait, hold on. So like my racing heart from that extra cup of coffee could actually make me perceive a totally neutral situation as like more threatening.
Exactly. One proponent of this idea, J.J. Prince, suggests that bodily feelings actually provide that raw data that our minds then interpret through the lens of all our experiences and knowledge.
Wow, okay, that adds like a whole new layer of complexity. So it's not just about what's happening around us, but also about what's happening inside us that shapes our emotional experience.
Yeah.
But before we get too deep into the whole body-mind connection, let's move on to our next category, response evaluation theories. What's the key insight here?
Response evaluation theories, or RETs, kind of shift the focus yet again. They suggest that the real key to understanding emotion lies not just in how we appraise that situation, but in how we evaluate our own responses to it.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Unpack that for me.
Sure. Imagine you're at a party and someone you were hoping to chat with just completely ignores you. That's the stimulus, the social snub. But now, instead of just simply reacting with, I don't know, hurt or anger, RETs suggest that you're actually engaging in this almost like rapid fire evaluation process.
Like a mini internal debate about how to handle the situation.
Exactly. You might think, okay, should I confront them? Should I ignore them back? Should I just go find someone else to talk to? And your emotional experience is really shaped by this whole internal process of evaluating your potential responses, their likely outcomes, and how well they align with your own overall goals.
So it's not just a knee-jerk reaction, there's like an element of strategy involved. Yeah.
Absolutely. RETs propose that we are constantly engaged in this goal-directed cycle. So we detect a discrepancy between, let's say, our desired state, like having a pleasant conversation with that person, and then our current state being ignored. And then we select a strategy to kind of bridge that gap. And that's based on our evaluation of the possible actions and, of course, their likely consequences.
So my emotional response is shaped by my assessment of which action is most likely to help me achieve my goal in that specific situation. But wait, wouldn't that mean that our emotions are, like, always rational? What about those times when we totally act impulsively or make decisions we later regret?
That's a great point. RETs don't claim that our emotions are always rational. In fact, they actually acknowledge that our evaluations can be flawed, right? We might overestimate the value of a certain action, underestimate the downsides, or even just simply misinterpret the situation entirely.
So those like seemingly irrational outbursts of anger or those moments of just like crippling self-doubt, those could actually be explained by errors in our evaluation process and not because emotions are just like inherently illogical.
Exactly. And this brings us to a key figure in RPs, Agnes Moore. Her goal-directed theory delves really deep into the mechanics of this evaluation process, offering a pretty compelling explanation for, I think, just the complexity of emotional experience.
It sounds like RPTs provide a framework for understanding both the seemingly rational and irrational aspects of our emotions. But hold on, we've got one more category to explore, and this one sounds like a real mind-bender. Psychological constructionist theories. Are you telling me that emotions aren't even real?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Psychological constructionist theories, or PCTs, challenge this very notion of emotions as these distinct prepackaged entities. Instead, they propose that emotions are actually constructed by our minds, like in the moment, based on a combination of our bodily sensations, our thoughts, and just our understanding of the world around us.
Okay, you're going to have to break this down for me. Are you saying that my feelings aren't real?
It's not that your feelings aren't real, it's more about how we conceptualize them. PCT suggests that instead of having these distinct essential categories for emotions like fear or joy, we actually create these experiences through a process of categorization. So our minds are constantly taking in information from our bodies and the world around us, and then using that information to construct our emotional experiences.
So instead of my brain having a specific fear program that gets triggered, my mind is creating the experience of fear based on a whole bunch of different factors.
Exactly. Think of it this way. You experience, a racing heart, maybe some sweaty palms. Is that fear? Is that excitement? Or is that just too much coffee? PCTs argue that our understanding of the situation, our past experiences, and even our cultural knowledge all play a role in how we actually categorize and ultimately experience that physiological arousal.
That's a pretty radical departure from the idea of hardwired emotions. But is there any evidence to support this view?
Absolutely. One classic study that really kind of shook things up was conducted by Schachter and Singer back in the 1960s.
Wait, wasn't that the experiment where they injected people with adrenaline? I remember reading about that.
You got it. In this experiment, participants were injected with adrenaline, which causes a bunch of physical symptoms like, a racing heart, increased breathing. But here's the twist. Some participants were told what to expect, while others were kept in the dark. And then they were exposed to either a happy or angry Confederate, basically an actor pretending to be another participant.
So everyone got the same physiological jolt from the adrenaline, but they were put in totally different social contexts.
Exactly. And the results were fascinating. The participants who weren't told about the adrenaline's effects actually ended up feeling either happy or angry, depending on the behavior of that Confederate. It was like their minds were using that social context to try and make sense of their physical sensations.
That's wild. So even though their bodies were having the same response, their minds were interpreting it differently based on the situation.
Precisely. This study provided strong evidence for the idea that our emotional experiences are not simply these, hardwired reactions, but they're actively constructed by our minds based on this really complex interplay of our bodily sensations, our thoughts, and of course, our perceptions.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. But before we dive even deeper into this world of constructed emotions, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll explore the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett, one of the leading researchers in this field. And we'll delve into some of the implications of PCTs for understanding our own emotional lives. Stay tuned.
Sounds good. Welcome back. Before the break, we were just starting to get into those mind-bending psychological constructionist theories, right? The idea that emotions aren't these fixed things, but something our minds are actively creating.
Right. And that Schachter and Singer experiment, I'm still thinking about that. It's like our bodies might be giving us the raw materials, but our minds are the master chefs whipping up the emotional experience based on whatever the recipe of the moment is.
I love that analogy. And speaking of master chefs of emotion, we can't talk about PCTs without mentioning Lisa Feldman Barrett. Her work has really been groundbreaking in advancing this view.
Okay, fill me in. What's at the heart of Barrett's theory?
Well, Barrett argues that we don't actually have dedicated brain circuits for all these specific emotions, like fear or anger. Instead, we have this more general purpose system that just generates these basic feelings of pleasantness or unpleasantness, arousal or calmness.
So like a spectrum of feeling rather than these distinct categories.
Exactly. And then our brains use what she calls emotion concepts, which are basically mental models of what different emotions are supposed to feel and look like to try and make sense of these basic feelings.
So it's like having this mental toolbox full of labels and scripts for all these different emotions. And then depending on the situation, my brain is just pulling out whichever tools seem to fit best.
Precisely. And that means our past experiences, our cultural background, even the language we speak, can all influence how we actually categorize and experience our own emotions.
Wow, so there's a lot more flexibility to emotions than we might think. But hold on. If it's all about interpretation, wouldn't that mean we could just, choose to feel happy all the time?
Well, that's a question that a lot of people ask. And it's understandable why. But while we might have more influence over our emotions than we previously thought, it's not quite as simple as just, flipping a switch.
Right, there's that pesky reality thing to contend with.
Yeah.
But still, it's a really intriguing idea that we might have more agency in shaping our own emotional landscape than we realize.
Absolutely. And it's not just about choosing to feel happy, it's also about recognizing that our emotional experiences aren't fixed and absolute. They're constantly evolving based on our interpretations and understanding.
Okay, I'm starting to get the appeal of PCTs, even if it's still bending my brain a little bit. But before we get too carried away with this idea of constructing our own emotional realities, I got to bring up like the skeptic in the room.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking here of James Russell and his critique of emotions as these distinct categories.
Ah, yes. Russell raises some really important points. He doesn't deny that we have emotional experiences, but he's skeptical of the idea that emotions like fear or anger exist as these distinct scientifically verifiable categories.
So he's not saying that my fear isn't real, just that maybe it's not as clear-cut as we tend to think.
Exactly. He suggests that what we call fear might actually just be a cluster of all these different experiences that we've kind of lumped together under one label. And that label, rather than reflecting this objective reality, might actually be shaping how we experience and express those feelings.
So the way we even talk about emotions could be influencing how we feel them. That's pretty meta.
It is. He encourages us to really focus on what he calls emotional meta experience, which is basically our awareness and understanding of our own emotional processes.
So instead of getting caught up in trying to perfectly define or categorize our emotions, we can simply observe them with curiosity and openness.
Precisely. And this shift in perspective, Russell argues, might actually lead to a much richer and more nuanced understanding of our own emotional lives.
This is all so fascinating. But I have to admit, I'm starting to feel a little overwhelmed. We've covered evolutionary theories, stimulus evaluation theories, response evaluation theories, and now psychological constructionist theories. Each one is offering a different piece of the puzzle. But it's hard to see the full picture.
It's understandable. It's a lot to take in. But remember, the goal of our deep dive today isn't necessarily to find the one right answer or declare one theory the winner. It's really about expanding our understanding of this incredibly complex phenomenon and just recognizing that each theory offers these really valuable insights.
You're right. It's like we're piecing together this giant jigsaw puzzle, and each theory is providing us with a few more pieces. But what does this all actually mean for me? For the average person just trying to navigate the ups and downs of life? How can these theories actually help me understand and manage my own emotions?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. And the good news is that these theories aren't just these abstract concepts. They actually offer a lot of practical tools and strategies for cultivating much healthier relationships with our own emotions.
Okay, I'm all ears. Give me some actionable insights.
Okay, well, let's start with those stimulus evaluation theories. Remember how they emphasize the importance of appraisal? Well, understanding that our evaluations are really what shapes our emotional responses can actually be incredibly empowering. It kind of suggests that we have some agency, some control over how we actually feel.
So instead of feeling like I'm a victim of my own emotions, I can start to actually examine my own appraisal process. Like if I'm feeling super anxious about giving a presentation, I can ask myself, why am I even feeling this way? Is my evaluation accurate, or am I letting past experiences or negative self-talk cloud my judgment?
Exactly. By recognizing that role of appraisal, we can start to challenge those unhelpful evaluations and potentially even shift our emotional responses. It's kind of like reframing a situation to see it from a totally different perspective.
That's a great tip. But what about those times when my emotions just feel completely overwhelming? Like I'm just on this runaway train. Can response evaluation theories offer any guidance in those situations?
Absolutely. Remember that goal-directed cycle we talked about? Well, it highlights that we're not just these passive recipients of emotions, but we're actually active agents, constantly striving towards our goals. So even in the midst of all those intense emotions, we can try to actually identify those underlying goals that are driving those emotions.
So if I'm feeling incredibly angry after an argument, I can take a step back and ask myself, what's my goal here? Is it to punish the other person? Is it to prove that I'm right? Or is it to actually try to find a resolution and preserve the relationship?
Exactly. By clarifying your goal, you can potentially shift your emotional experience and choose a much more constructive course of action.
That's really helpful. And what about those psychological constructionist theories? How can the idea of constructed emotions even help me navigate this crazy emotional roller coaster of life?
Well, PCTs remind us that emotions aren't these fixed entities, right? They're much more fluid experiences, and they're really shaped by our interpretations and understanding. This means we actually have the potential to kind of influence our emotional landscape by doing things like expanding our emotional vocabulary or challenging some of those more rigid emotion concepts that we have, and even just exploring new ways of experiencing and expressing our emotions.
So instead of getting stuck in those same old patterns of like anger or sadness, I can actually try to unpack those experiences and understand those underlying sensations, thoughts, and perceptions that are contributing to them, and then potentially even create new, more helpful ways of relating to my own emotions.
Precisely. It's kind of like becoming an architect of your own emotional experience rather than this passive inhabitant of a pre-designed structure.
That's such a powerful image. But let's be real, changing those ingrained emotional habits, it's not easy, right? It's like trying to rewire your brain.
You're absolutely right. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes a willingness to really challenge your own assumptions about yourself. But remember, even those small shifts in perspective can have this huge ripple effect on your emotional well-being. And seeking professional help, from therapists or counselors, can be incredibly valuable in navigating all these complex emotional waters. They can provide that personalized guidance and support in actually applying these theories to your own specific circumstances.
That makes sense. It's like having a personal trainer, but for your emotional fitness.
Hmm.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored four major families of emotion theories, each with their own, strengths, limitations, and of course, practical implications. We've challenged this whole notion of emotions as these simple, hardwired responses and really opened up the possibility that they're a lot more fluid, nuanced, and even constructible than we might have realized.
And hopefully, along the way, we've sparked a little bit of curiosity and kind of inspired you to continue exploring this fascinating world of emotions.
Absolutely. I feel like I've gained this whole new vocabulary for understanding myself and other people. But as with any good deep dive, I feel like we've also uncovered more questions than answers.
And that's the beauty of it, right? The exploration of emotions, it's this ongoing process. It's really about embracing that complexity, staying curious, and just continuing to learn and grow.
Well said. So to our listeners, we encourage you to keep diving deeper into this fascinating world of human emotion. Pay attention to your own experiences, observe all those emotional dynamics in your own relationships, and just don't be afraid to ask those questions. The more we understand about emotions, the more connected and compassionate we can be, both with ourselves and with others.
And who knows, maybe by better understanding this whole language of emotions, we can create a more harmonious and fulfilling world for everyone.
That's a beautiful thought to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of emotions. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to the deep dive. Before the break, we were teasing this idea of emotions as not just these personal experiences, but also this hidden language that shapes how we interact with other people.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how these theories can illuminate the dynamics between people. We can actually use them to analyze how emotions are communicated, how they influence our relationships, and even how they contribute to cultural norms.
Okay, I'm ready to go social. Let's start with those evolutionary theories. Do they suggest it's all about survival of the fittest with emotions just driving all this competition and dominance?
Not necessarily. While evolutionary theories definitely acknowledge the role of emotions in competition, they also really highlight how important they are for cooperation and social bonding. Think back to those universal facial expressions we were talking about earlier. They're not just personal expressions. They're actually signals that help us coordinate our actions and build trust with each other.
So that smile isn't just about me feeling happy. It's also a way of signaling, friendliness and approachability to other people, like a social cue.
Exactly. And those subtle signs of fear or anger, well, they can actually serve as warnings, helping us avoid potential conflicts or maybe even danger, and ultimately strengthening that group cohesion.
But couldn't those same expressions be used, deceptively? What if someone's faking a smile just to gain your trust, or maybe feigning anger to try and intimidate you?
That's a great point, and that's where things get really interesting. In our social interactions, we're constantly evaluating the authenticity of those emotional expressions, right? We're trying to figure out, is this genuine emotion or is this just straight up manipulation?
It's like we're all playing this social game of poker, trying to read each other's tells and figure out those real motives behind the emotional displays.
That is a perfect analogy. And this kind of brings us back to stimulus evaluation theories and their social implications. Remember how SETIs emphasize the importance of appraisal in shaping our emotional responses? Well, our appraisals are heavily influenced by the people around us.
So it's not just about how I see a situation, but also about how everyone else seems to be reacting to it.
Precisely. Our social environment really provides this important context for our own appraisals. We use the emotions and behaviors of others as these cues to interpret and evaluate situations. Like if everyone else seems calm and collected during a presentation, I'm less likely to totally freak out even if I'm feeling nervous.
That makes sense. I mean, we are social creatures after all.
Right.
But what about cultural differences? Do city take that into account? Like how different cultures might interpret the exact same situation in very different ways.
Absolutely. Social and cultural norms have a huge impact on our appraisal processes. Different cultures have different values, beliefs, and expectations about how emotions should be expressed and managed. What might be considered a rude gesture in one culture could actually be a sign of respect in another.
So a seemingly simple interaction could actually be loaded with all these culturally specific emotional meanings. That's fascinating. Okay, so we've covered evolutionary theories, stimulus evaluation theories in a social context. What about response evaluation theories? How do they fit into all of this?
Well, remember how RETs focus on how we evaluate our own responses to situations? Well, in social interactions, those evaluations are totally intertwined with our understanding of other people and our goals for the relationship.
So if my goal is to maintain harmony with my partner, I might just choose to bite my tongue, even if they do something that annoys me. My desire to avoid conflict outweighs my immediate impulse to react.
Exactly. We're constantly weighing those potential costs and benefits of different emotional responses, factoring in things like our goals for the relationship, social norms, and just our predictions of how the other person's going to react.
It sounds exhausting. Like we're always strategizing our emotional moves. No wonder relationships can be so complicated.
You're right. It is a delicate dance. And just like in any dance, there can be some missteps and misunderstandings. Sometimes we misread signals, make the wrong move, and kind of trigger those unintended emotional consequences.
Which brings us to, the wild world of psychological constructionist theories and their social implications.
Mhm.
If emotions are actually constructed, as PCT suggests, does that mean our social interactions are just this giant performance, with everyone just kind of acting out their pre-scripted emotional roles?
It's not quite that simple. While PCTs acknowledge the strong influence of social context on how we actually construct our emotions, they don't deny the reality or the depth of those experiences.
So it's not like we're just robots, blindly following a social script.
Exactly. We learn about emotions from our families, our culture, the media. All these sources provide us with these emotion concepts, those building blocks that we use to make sense of our feelings. But those building blocks are constantly being assembled and reassembled in the moment based on the specific context of our interactions.
So it's like we're all improvising on a stage, drawing from this shared repertoire of emotional scripts, but ultimately creating something unique and meaningful in each interaction.
That's a great way to put it. And this really highlights the dynamic interplay between the personal and the social in our emotional lives. We're both shaped by our social world and actively shaping it through our own emotional expressions and interactions.
Wow. This whole deep dive has really given me a new appreciation for just how complex emotions really are. We've gone from those basic evolutionary drives to the intricacies of social and cultural influences, and we even questioned the very nature of emotions as these fixed categories. It's been a wild ride.
It has. And the journey doesn't end here. We've only scratched the surface of this vast and fascinating subject. Hopefully, we've sparked your curiosity and maybe given you some new tools for thinking about and navigating your own emotional landscape.
Absolutely. I feel like I've gained a whole new vocabulary for understanding myself and other people. But, as with any good deep dive, I feel like we've also uncovered more questions than answers.
And that's the beauty of it, the exploration of emotions. It's this ongoing process, right? It's about embracing that complexity, staying curious, and just continuing to learn and grow.
Well said. So to our listeners, we really encourage you to keep diving deeper into this whole world of human emotions. Pay attention to your own experiences, observe the emotional dynamics in your own relationships, and just don't be afraid to ask those questions. The more we understand about emotions, the more connected and compassionate we can be, both with ourselves and with others.
And who knows? Maybe by better understanding this language of emotions, we can actually create a more harmonious and fulfilling world for everyone.
That's a beautiful thought to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of emotions. We'll see you next time.